developers attempt to hold an important implementation of a policy that we as a city adopted. We've won that fight thanks to the advocacy of many groups, many members of our coalition, and now we want to take on the next important challenges that exist. Challenges that relate to residents being left out of the planning and co-development of the communities. We want to make sure that our communities are not steamrolled, irresponsible development happens in our communities, and we also want to hold our government accountable. We now have nothing in the way of delivering on affordable housing, and we need those commitments from our next mayor. We have a mayoral by-election on June, so I want to remind everyone who's watching, ask the tough questions of our mayoral candidates on whether they're committed to not just making sure that housing is affordable, but making the necessary investments so that more people access a pathway to home ownership, are able to live in their communities and not feel that they're at risk of being uprooted or moved out of their communities. So we're going to now take some questions from the media, from our friends at the media gallery, the press. So please do ask your questions, and we'd love to answer.
Well, you're saying that this fight over the definition of affordable housing is you've declared victory on that for the moment. But what about going forward? The deputy mayor was advancing the city's housing plans this morning at a press conference, saying that the city has ambitious targets that they hope to meet over the next 10 years. Are you concerned about no matter how many housing units actually get built, that they won't be affordable, and what do you think the city should be doing around that?
That's excellent. Well, the city now has all the tools it needs in their box. There's no outstanding appeal to implement a policy that's going to help us define what affordable housing. But what we need from our cities, especially our next mayor, is leadership in making sure that our next budget commits to more affordable housing, but also exploring partnerships with other levels of government. What's really frustrating the residents of Toronto is how the different levels of government are not really working closely together with the community. We need to all be at the table when we're discussing our national housing strategy and how to make sure that big cities like Toronto are able to leverage the investments, the capital that are needed to build affordable housing, but also programs that promote a pathway to home ownership for many residents of the city. I recall a prime minister, campaigning on rent to own, for example, where those rent to own dollars in our communities, right? We need to see a translation from rhetoric to action. So I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
The deputy mayor was also talking today about how she believes that the next mayor will agree that housing is a priority. It seems that there is, at all levels of government, a recognition that there is a crisis right now. Are you at all concerned that any of the progress that has been made to date in Toronto could be torn up by whoever is elected mayor if we have someone who doesn't share the idea that housing is a priority?
Yeah, that's actually an excellent question, Dan. I think we have a lot of work ahead of us. There is tremendous efforts within our communities to make sure that whoever is elected as our next mayor understands that housing is a basic human right and should follow through with the expertise and the evidence that actually speaks to if you house residents of Toronto, you're dealing with a lot of social determinants that impact their health in the long term, right? We're in the midst, we just went through a pandemic, went through a global pandemic. We have a lot of mental health needs. We need new supportive housing. We need modular housing. We need all forms of housing to better support the residents of Toronto. And we need a caring mayor. We need a mayor that understands that we can't all succeed if so many of us are left behind. And look at how many young people, how many people cannot access affordable home ownership. In fact, let's look at the rental rates and the rental market and how that's become such a speculative market with rents just getting out of control. And what is our premier doing about that? What is our provincial government doing about rent controls. There are evidence-based solutions that we can put in place to stop this cycle, never-ending cycle of making folks feel that they're not heard, they're not seen. And we need to act on the fact that we have many folks in our encampments, in our shelter system. We just heard from my friend Alejandra about how many people are homeless across the city of Toronto, and those numbers just keep going up. We need a caring mayor that is going to be dedicated to solving the housing crisis by working with the community, not working with just developers and putting forward solutions that are not based on what the community's needs are.
Obviously the...
Sorry, can I just continue on the same question before we move on? Just from having done this for a while, I don't think there's disagreement about whether or not housing is a priority. I think it's a disagreement about the mechanisms that will get us there. And too often, what we're seeing is leadership choose options that cut red tape, by which they mean destroying democratic institutions that we rely on in order to make way for developers to build as much as they want, wherever they want. And that's not ever going to be the solution. We need leaders at all levels of government that will do what's needed to face this crisis. And that will mean facing up to developers. That will mean ending financialization. That will mean building compassionate systems. And we really need to pay attention to the way that mayoral candidates speak about this issue.
Just back to the plan that was the housing plan that was talked about this morning. Do you think that there is a space for council to sort of proceed with the one that was, created by John Tory, even though the fact that we don't have a mayor and there is going to be obviously a by-election that could potentially change course on all of that?
It's an excellent question. With new city leadership, there will be a new set of priorities, and that's something that we expect. What we're hoping is active members of our community, members of our coalitions, residents that are really invested in solutions, is we want to make sure our next mayor is a champion for housing, and actually works with our communities to make sure that the financial incentivization of housing ends. When are we going to learn, my friends? Look at our housing market. We have seen a depreciation of almost 25% for the past 12 months, right? This is because of speculation and people thinking that the way you invest is necessarily in building housing. What we need to remember is that the real investment should come from our government in our people by providing housing, making it accessible, right? And I think it's also an opportunity for us to think about the solutions that community members have been calling for, whether it's new supportive housing, modular housing, but also dedicated programs. I'm not gonna stop talking about this. Rent to own, a pathway to home ownership. Those are critical interventions to make sure that residents are not uprooted from their communities. And you see that across the city of Toronto. It's becoming less accessible to access housing, and this needs to end. This era needs to end with a new mayor that is committed to making sure that those targets are met, and better yet, exceeded across the city of Toronto. Okay, my friends, any other questions?
That's it, the questions for today.
We're done. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you. Thank you so much for covering this important story. And let's celebrate this big victory. Thank you.
Yes. Woo!